Hello everybody! Today I want to talk about theming in server-side rendered apps. This is planned to be a lightning talk, so let's get on with it. First things first, my name is Trulia. I'm a senior software engineer at Zillow. I work on the Trulia team here in San Francisco. We're also hiring, so please reach out to me on Twitter if you're looking for your next adventure. I'm currently working on a side project called NDA-Fi. And today I'll be talking about theming in server-side rendered apps from my experiences working on NDA-Fi. NDA-Fi is open source, so feel free to check it out on GitHub if you're interested in seeing how it all fits together in the wild. By theming, I'm specifically talking about a light theme or dark theme, or auto-switching between the two based on system settings. You can get pretty creative with theming, and a lot of people do, but a dark mode is the most widely adopted. And looks like more developers implement dark mode just to impress people than required by their contractual obligations. So this better be fun, right? In preparing for this talk, I stumbled upon a blog post by Josh Kamal on how he implemented dark mode for his blog, and that it wasn't the most trivial thing it seems. Out of everything us front-end developers have to deal with. Am I right? So what really makes it so hard? Let's talk about how some of the issues I faced, and how removing complexity and approaching the solution from first principles helped mitigate those problems. Let's imagine a world where we delegate the styling to the client side. Duh, you might say. After all, that's what browsers are designed to do the best. So why get in the way? Especially given how CSS has come a long way, theming doesn't take too much effort. Combine media queries with CSS variables, and you have it in just a few lines of CSS. Given how writing CSS feels like most of the time, that doesn't even feel like writing CSS, does it? But what happens when you have slightly different requirements and say you want a little more control over the state machine that controls the theming? So let's expand a little on our requirements. What do we really want? We want to make default behavior match system behavior. We want to allow user to override the default theme. We want to be able to persist user preference on both the client and the server side. And we want to be flexible enough to override the theme setting on a per page basis. Ideally, we want all of that, and we also want to avoid the dark mode flicker caused by the initial render, avoid JavaScript dependent CSS in order to reduce initial render times and time to interactive. We want to avoid costly local storage lookups. And finally, my favorite, we want to keep it simple. You might think, since we want more control, why not use the CSS in JS solution? Would that help? Unfortunately, the answer is no. To me, using window.matchMedia to manage theming, it's like using window.innerWidth to do responsive layout in JavaScript. It just doesn't feel like the right tool for the job. Also, in a server-side rendered app, there are bits and pieces that are only available to us at client runtime. The server, which needs to send over the initial HTML to the client, does not know anything about the client's media preferences. So it would have to default to either a light or dark theme and switch it out for what the user prefers when that information becomes available on the client side. Unfortunately, this causes an undesired flash. When the theme we deliver to the user is not the same as what the user has set in their preferences. There are solutions that inject a render blocking script to avoid this issue, but in my opinion, this is a bit of an overkill for what we're trying to achieve. Especially as our apps grow in size, these additional complexities make our app less readable and add up to haunt us further down the road. Now, having access to client metadata means we have to make assumptions. And assumptions almost always lead to conflict. If we think about a few slides back when we implemented theming using just plain CSS, we didn't have to make any hard assumptions about our client because, well, we shifted that responsibility to the client. So what if we still outsource that work to the client, which provides solution to most of the harder problems we have on our list of requirements, but use hints to override client's behavior from the server side? And that's exactly what we're going to do. So how do we solve this problem? Well, nothing new really, with cookies. Cookies are often used to solve a similar problem with authentication in server-side rendered apps. So let's discuss how we can do the same, but this time for theming. So before we write any code, let's talk about how we want to use cookies to achieve our goal. Here, client makes a request to our app. The server responds with the SSR HTML as well as CSS that contain rules which are used to overwrite the defined behavior. We'll look at what that really means later. With that, the browser simply does the same it did in our basic CSS example from earlier, giving us the result we want. And remember, we want the least intrusive solution. So we simply don't do anything. Later, when the user sets their theme preference, our client app updates the DOM to reflect the change and saves it in a cookie, which will be part of the normal request response routine going forward. So nothing extraordinary. Default behavior with cookies. The next time the server sees a cookie value, you'll include it as part of the payload when the DOM is rendered. With that, when the client receives the HTML payload with a more specific rule, the result of the media query will be overwritten by that conflicting rule. And that's basically how everything works at a high level. Now, let's see how we can implement this. Earlier, I mentioned of conflicting rules to overwrite the theming behavior. By that, I meant in CSS, since all other things being equal, the last defined style wins, we can control what rules a media query yields by overwriting the previous rule in the same query. For example, if the media query yields light mode, but the user selects dark mode, our HTML payload can include a predefined class attribute to reverse the theme the resulting query would normally render. If, however, the user does not indicate a theme preference, then only the query that matches the system theme is actuated. This simple solution really allows us to control the behavior when we need to, but otherwise let the queries operate normally when the user indicates no preference. I also created a context-based API to manage the cookie value, as well as the class attribute that overrules the normal query behavior. So changing the theme is as easy as importing the useTheme hook anywhere in your app. Finally, you will need to extend your _app and _document to make the solution work across all your pages. And notice how you can override the theme on a per page basis by simply setting a class property on a page. This allows us to force a specific theme on some pages regardless of user setting. Why? Because don't we all have that designer on our teams that demand just a little more? Now, what if we wanted to persist the theme preference, let's say in a database for a logged in user? This could easily be done using a custom middleware that parses the value from the cookie and saves it to a database as part of the user's profile. At a later time, if the user makes a request and hasn't specified a theme in a cookie, we can look up their preference in the database and simply update the cookie on the server, as if it was sent by the client to create the same effect. I'm hoping to implement this middleware as part of the open source NDA5 project. So if you want to learn more, feel free to subscribe to NDA5's update on GitHub. For everything else I discussed today, check out the demo I have up on GitHub. One thing you might also want to try when you run the demo is turn off JavaScript after switching to dark mode and refresh the page. Unlike local storage-based solutions, the dark mode should still stick around since the theme value is available to the server when the initial payload is rendered. You might also want to ask yourself, is there a simpler solution? Well, not really. There is currently a drafted proposal for including clients' media preferences in the HTTP headers, so the server knows what exactly it needs to deliver to the client based on those media headers. But this only addresses part of the problem. You would still need cookies or another solution to render correctly on the server side. And that's only if this option ever becomes widely adopted. But it would still all come down to what your requirements are. The cookie-based solution wasn't designed for SSG in mind, but I don't see why we can't tweak it to work in an SSG setup. Although we would probably have to compromise a little on performance, because we would still need to somehow intercept the delivery of our app, either before sending our static HTML down the wire or before rendering off the DOM on the client side. Similar to the other solutions I briefly mentioned earlier. Well, that's it for me today. Thanks so much for having me, and don't forget to check out Zillow's career page if you're looking for a new gig, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. See you around. Cheers.